Studies have found that this is true with respect to the general population and LGB populations, correct?
Yeah, again, it's correct in the sense of black versus white LGB, but the LGB versus heterosexuals, which is what I was testifying to, that was higher. Yeah, but in the general population, meaning not necessarily gay samples, the finding is that as you described it.
Okay, we will turn to studies of heterosexuals versus LGB individuals immediately after this exhibit, but I'm testing the minority stress theory generally, which is why I'm exploring some of the work you've done relating to gender and to race.
Okay.
Now, other studies have shown that African Americans, in fact, have higher self-esteem and well-being than whites. Is that correct?
That's in the general population.
Yes.
Yes.
We'll look at page 8 of this exhibit, and again, we're at tab 10. And starting about halfway down the middle of the paragraph at the bottom of the second column, I'm going to read that to you, and it says that our results show inconsistent support for minority stress hypotheses should lead to a re-examination and, if necessary, elaboration of the minority stress model. We are particularly struck by the finding that black LGB respondents, clearly a disadvantaged social group in American society, do not show higher levels of depressive symptoms and lower levels of well-being than their white counterparts. This finding clearly challenges minority stress theory. That this finding is consistent with findings about black, white differences and well-being in the general population, as well as findings regarding differences in prevalence of mental disorders between black and white LGB, strengthens our confidence that these findings are not a result of some bias in our study. Now, those are your words, correct?
Yes.
And does that not fairly summarize?
That's one of the conclusions that we came to, yes.
Okay, and if you will turn over the page to the next paragraph, the top of page 9, the first column, says, the lack of parsimony in our results represents a challenge in social stress theory. It suggests that a theory cannot be applied uniformly and that greater definitions and distinctions are necessary in further research. Correct?
Correct.
And we discussed parsimony a minute ago, correct?
It is saying exactly what I said. That I guess the word challenge needs to be explained. What I'm saying here is that we need to examine, because of those differences, the commonalities and divergences. We need to try to better, we would call it specify the model. That it would be a better model predicting those types of outcomes so that so that we can explain them better.
But you said that it means that the theory cannot be applied uniformly and that greater definition and distinctions are necessary, correct?
Exactly.
All right, thank you. And please turn to tab 11 in the witness binder, and you'll find a document pre-marked DIX 1246. Can you identify this document?
1246.
Yes, it's tab 11.
Yes, that's an article that I wrote that was published in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior in 1995.
Okay, thank you. And again, this is one that was designated by the plaintiffs as 1002, Your Honor, and I believe that it is in evidence.
Very well.
No objection.
Correct?
I'm sorry?
1002, PX 1002. Could I have opposing counsel confirm that that was in fact admitted?
Yes, 1002
Yes.
is in.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Now this document discusses a study that you conducted, correct?
Yes, this was my dissertation study.
This was your doctoral dissertation, you said.
Yeah, this was based on the dissertation. This is a publication that came out of it, yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, now please look at page 39 in the middle of the, well, towards the top of the second column, about 3 sentences into the first full paragraph where you write, it has been predicted that if minority position is stressful, and if the stress is related to psychological distress, the minority groups must have higher rates of distress than non-minority groups. But studies that compared rates of distress and disorder between blacks and whites, women and men, and homosexuals and heterosexuals did not confirm such predictions, leading some researchers to refute minority stress conceptualizations. And the study goes on to list a number of citations, a number of studies, including, I believe I count 9 on, quote, gay straight differences, correct?
Right.
So those studies at least, do not support the social stress model as it applies to LGB individuals. Is that correct?
Those are the studies I was referring to before when you asked me the questions about Evelyn Hooker and so forth, that in the past demonstrated that. And as I also said in many of the publications, that the studies in the 90s are the ones that began to use more advanced accepted methods that begin to show this difference. And in fact, the point of this article is to show the support for minority stress. And this is the article that actually first introduced the concept and demonstrated how it does work. In other words, it is supported. So this was just the introduction to this.
All right, thank you. But the studies that you cite here, you characterize as studies that compared rates of distress and disorder between homosexuals and heterosexuals and did not confirm such predictions. And the predictions to which you're referring earlier in that sentence already, it has been predicted that if minority position is stressful, and if this stress is related to psychological distress, then minority groups must have higher rates of distress than non-minority groups, correct?
Yeah, so those older studies did not show that. As we
sorry?
yesterday.
Oh, right. So those studies at least were inconsistent with your model, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And your 1995 study did not look at intergroup comparisons, correct? And by intergroup comparisons, I mean comparisons between heterosexuals and LGB individuals.
No. I did this most fully in the 2003 article that we discussed earlier.
Yes, but in the 1995, you did not, correct?
Well, this was looking at a group of gay men.
And in fact, in that article you stated that, just lower down the page, you say, I suggest that we must re-examine our reliance on evidence from intergroup comparisons of rates of distress. Despite the intuitive appeal of this approach, numerous methodological problems lead to bias, making it difficult to interpret the evidence from studies using this approach, correct?
Well, this refers to, we refer to different generations of studies in psychiatric epidemiology. There was a huge shifting in understanding how to do studies like that. So I'm saying here what I said in that, what you're quoting, that those older articles are not a good indication for the assessment of those differences because they didn't use sampling methodologies that would be correct, that would allow us to draw those conclusions. They didn't at the time have the diagnostic criteria that were that clear, and they certainly did not have any measures to assess those. So there were a lot of methodological problems in those earlier studies, including the studies that we were discussing earlier when you quoted some of the, again, early studies that do not talk to the effect of prevalence. So there would have been two groups of gay versus straight, but there were not studies of prevalence in the population. So therefore, they are not reliable as an estimate of the difference in the prevalence.
Okay, but you suggest, and I quote, I suggest that we must re-examine reliance on evidence from intergroup comparisons of rates of disorder. Is that correct?
Yes, because of that problem and the other issues that I think I list here.
Okay, and thank you. And that's why you did not conduct an intergroup study in 1995, correct?
I wouldn't say that is why I didn't conduct it, but I was using this study as another anchor on this problem, on this question. As I said, we used, we tried to use different approaches to study the same problem from different sides so that we can see divergences and inconsistencies so that we can, by looking at those, improve our way that we understand the problem and the theories. This is not unique, to these studies. For example, there was a time that people thought that all cancers were caused by some kind of genetic mutation. And then they find studies that don't confirm that, and therefore they go on and investigate further. And then they say, some studies, cancers are caused by an infectious agent. So that's what I mean by improving the model. So now we understand something a little better about how cancer is caused. So in the same way that we always try to challenge our results in our studies using different methodologies, different ways of assessing the basic theory that we discussed here as social stress, and use it. So when I say the word challenge, we use it to further study things that are discovered in, let's say, inconsistencies. So some of the inconsistencies that you described are now the subject of further investigation.
Okay, thank you. But you found, or your findings in this study contrasted with previous evidence compiled on minority stress, correct?
Yeah, well, this study was looking within a group of gay men. It contrasts with those older studies that, as I said, did not show the differences. But as I also said, there were studies that were not up to par in terms of how we assess those issues now in terms of their ability to represent the population prevalence or the proportion of people in the population that have the disorder.
All right, but I'm not asking about the methodology of the previous studies. I'm just asking whether your findings in this study were inconsistent with those studies.
I mean, I guess you could... I think that I would say that the older studies were inconsistent with this new finding.
Okay, and if you'd please turn to page 51, if you would, please, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, Professor Meyer, let's, right in the middle of the second column on page 51, you write, these findings contrast with previous evidence compiled on minority stress. When studies compared rates of disorder or distress between minority and non-minority groups, we found little evidence that minority stress is related to adverse mental health. Is that correct?
Yes, those are the old studies that I mentioned.
Thank you. In the last paragraph of that page, a little further down, you say, certainly the issue of rates of disorder and distress cannot be sidestepped and will have to be addressed too. But if the present findings are convincing, we must address the question of rates of difference with this evidence in mind. The issue thus becomes one of explaining why there are no differences in rates of disorder between minority and non-minority populations, and how such findings could be consistent with the evidence that not just social conditions do, in fact, have adverse mental health effects. And you wrote that, is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of what I was trying to explain.
Thank you. Let's turn back to tab 3, and we discussed this document a moment ago, and it is in evidence, so we can go straight tab 3, Your Honor. And this is your 2003 article where you did look at intergroup comparisons. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yes. Thank you. And in the
Page.
middle,
What page?
that was just a general question, Your Honor.
I thought you were about ready to read something.
I am. I will ask you, Professor Meyer, to turn to page 684.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Please look at the second sentence of the first full paragraph. It starts in drawing.
Uh-huh.
In drawing a conclusion about whether LGB groups have higher prevalences of mental disorders, one should proceed with caution. The studies are few, methodologies and measurements are inconsistent, and trends in the findings are not always easy to interpret. Although several studies show significant elevation in prevalence of disorders of LGB people, some do not. So at the time you wrote this, you believed that, at least, some of the previous studies were inconsistent with the minority stress model, correct?
Yeah, we are talking still about the same studies that were the older studies. And the reason that I did this paper is to use only the better studies, the ones that can actually answer the question. And that's what the findings in this paper demonstrate.
Okay, thank you. Now, please look at page 685. Look at page 685 and look at the second full paragraph on the page. You describe, well, I'll just read it. 2 studies assess the risk for completed suicides among gay men. These studies assessed the prevalences of homosexuality among completed suicides and found no overrepresentation of gay and bisexual men, concluding that LGBT populations are not at increased risk for suicide. Thus, findings from studies of completed suicides are inconsistent with studies finding the LGBT groups are at higher risk of suicide ideation and attempts than heterosexuals. In the very last sentence of the paragraph, you say, Considering the scarcity of studies, the methodological challenges, and the greater potential for bias in studies of completed suicide, it is difficult to draw firm conclusions from their apparent refutation of minority stress theory. Correct.
Well, this concerns a particular type of study that looks at completed suicide, at those people who are dead. And therefore, it is, there are only 2 of those, and it is very hard to assess the proportion of people there who were gay. So that's why I said it is hard to draw conclusions for those 2 studies.
But at least on their face, you describe them as presenting an apparent refutation of minority stress theory. Correct.
Yeah, apparent, yes, but I also say in the same paragraph that the methodological problems would preclude you from drawing those conclusions.
All right. And you said it was considering the scarcity of studies, the methodological challenge, and greater potential for bias, it's difficult to draw firm conclusions. That is correct.
About this particular issue of completed suicides.
Yes, thank you. Now, your 2003 study did conclude that LGB individuals have a higher prevalence of mental disorders than heterosexuals, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
As I said before, this was not my study. This was what we call a meta-analysis, which is a method of gathering data and information from other studies. So I looked at the other studies and came up with statistics that describe the aggregate of those studies. So the purpose of that is to get a better handle on those estimates, because you are using not just one study, but several studies that are available to you.
Correct. And you relied on 2 types of studies, correct? Studies that targeted LGB groups using non-probability samples, and studies that use probability samples of the general populations that allowed identification of LGB versus heterosexual groups, correct, in your meta-analysis?
Yeah, I looked at all of those studies, but in conclusion, I relied only on the studies that use probability samples. The studies that don't use probability samples are exactly the ones we were discussing earlier, and which is why I say that you cannot really draw good conclusions from them in terms of estimating prevalence. So I looked at, I think, all of the studies that were available going back, I think, to the 70s. And so when I say, when you say rely, I certainly looked at all of those, but in the meta-analysis, as most people do, you create a selection criteria for which studies you want to include, and in this case, I looked specifically at the ones that were community studies that are very large, and that involve probability samples, because probability samples allow us to then estimate back into the population the proportions, the prevalences, as we call them.
So when you say you looked at the first type of non-probability study, but you ultimately didn't rely on that, is that your explanation?
In the meta-analysis.
So the meta-analysis was based only on the, well, let me get your exact words. It's the probability samples of the general population that allowed identification.
Yeah, I think I did both, and I show, but yeah, in terms of drawing conclusion, I looked at different things, but in terms of drawing conclusion about prevalences, I relied on those studies that are probability studies. And
okay, thank you. I wasn't clear on that from the reading, the article. I do appreciate the clarification. So let's just talk about these probability studies then. The second group of studies you reviewed, the population. Well, the population-based studies do suffer from some methodological deficiencies, correct?
The population-based studies?
Yes.
Well, all studies suffer from methodological deficiencies, but the population-based studies are the best ones that we have to address this question. Those are very large population-based studies that the entire United States Public Health Service relies on. Those were the only evidence we have for prevalence of mental disorders in the United States.
Okay, thank you. And because none of these studies was a priori designed to assess mental health of the LGB groups, they were not sophisticated in the measurement of sexual orientation, correct?
Yes. Those were general population studies, and the LGB group were basically, whoever happened to be gay within the general population was included by virtue of the probability sampling.
The studies classified respondents as homosexual or heterosexual only on the basis of past sexual behavior rather than using a more complex matrix that assessed identity and attraction in addition to sexual behavior, correct?
If I said that, I assume it's correct. But I actually don't remember that all of them used even the exact same. But they usually would choose one measurement, and therefore they don't have a more complex measure. I don't remember independent that they all use the exact same measure that you just quoted. But
well, please look at page 685 in the second column. It's the last full paragraph on that page, so it's just above the carryover. And about partway down, I'm going to read it to you. It says, after the sentence, the first sentence says that they too suffer from methodological deficiencies. But then, and I'll start reading in full, it says, this is because none of these studies was a priori designed to assess mental health of LGB groups. As a result, they were not sophisticated in the measurement of sexual orientation. The studies classified respondents as homosexual or heterosexual only on the basis of past sexual behavior. In 1 year, and there's a citation to a study, in 5 years, and another citation, or over the lifetime, and a third citation, rather than using a more complex matrix that assessed identity and attraction in addition to sexual behavior. And another citation. The problem of measurement could have increased potential error due to misclarification, which in turn could have led to selection bias. Does that refresh your recollections?
Yes. I don't know if I'm referring here to a particular group or study, but let me just say that if this is true about all the studies that I use, but it may be. But in general, this is true the way you described it. There have been studies of this nature that use not just this one thing, but they all use a selected measure that they find the most relevant to their purpose. So I just can't confirm that all of the ones here, I would actually be surprised if they all use this exact same measure.
Well, just answer that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, basically, the main point that they do not use the more complex way of measuring that I agree with.
Thank you. And these population studies also suffer because they included a very small number of LGB people, correct?
Correct. But let me just say that this is why I conducted the meta-analysis, which allows you to, in a sense, increase your sample because you are then aggregating all of them. But on the other hand, if you are limited by some, maybe some comparisons that you might want to do. But to conduct the meta-analysis, I aggregated them to overcome this problem of small sample sizes.
Please look at page 688, if you would. And starting in the middle, at the middle of the carry-over paragraph, as you see it on 688, you write, my use of a meta-analytic technique to estimate combined ORs somewhat corrects this deficiency, but it is important to remember that a meta-analysis cannot overcome problems on the studies in which it is based. Correct?
It cannot overcome all the problems, but in this particular example that you used, it certainly overcomes the problem of the sample size. That's because you are adding all those samples together. But as I said, there is no method that is like 100% perfect, but it specifically overcomes the problem of both sample size and also what we call sampling error. So that if you just rely on one sample, you might have some specific biases connected with that. But if you aggregate, 5 samples, then that error will get lost within that bigger number of studies. So that's what it does. But it certainly doesn't, for example, overcome the issue of measurement because they all, You can't change the measures that they use. So it depends on what, you're talking about.
So it may overcome sample size, but it would not overcome lack of precision in the definition of LGB individuals. Is that correct?
I didn't say there was a lack of precision, but if there were a lack of precision, I said they didn't use the measure that they did use could have been precise, but they didn't use a more complex measure. But it wouldn't overcome measurement. We call it measurement error. Although it would help because of that question, because of that issue that I just said related to sampling error. Again, the best way to explain it is that when you take, even if one study has an error and maybe another has another error, when you aggregate them all together, they are part of it. But the larger pattern that you see will emerge despite different errors they will get. They are much better than if you just relied on one study with the error or with the bias.
But still, a meta-analysis cannot overcome all the problems in the study on which it is based, correct?
No.
And it's important to interpret results of a meta-analysis with caution on the critical perspective, correct?
Absolutely, yeah.
All right. And in this 2003 study, you described your conclusion as inconsistent with research and theoretical writings that can be described as a minority resilience hypothesis which claims that stigma does not negatively affect self-esteem, correct?
Yes.
And you described your conclusions as inconsistent with studies that showed that blacks do not have a higher prevalence of mental disorders than whites, as expected by the minority stress formulations, correct?
Yes.
You stated further research must address this apparent contradiction, correct?
Yes.
Please look at 688 again. I guess if you're still there, that'd be great.
Yes.
You write, one problem which can provide a plausible alternative explanation for the findings about prevalences of mental disorders in LGB individuals is that bias related to cultural differences between LGB and heterosexual persons inflates reports about history of mental health systems. It is plausible that cultural differences between LGB and heterosexual individuals cause a response bias that led to overestimation of mental disorders among LGB individuals. This would happen if, for example, LGB individuals were more likely to report mental health problems than heterosexual individuals. And then your article goes on to identify several reasons why LGB individuals might be more likely to report mental health problems than heterosexual individuals, correct?
Yes. That is one of the possible limitations in the sense that, we look at... as I said earlier, when I described the methodology of working on studies, we look at all kinds of potential explanations and try to address them. Assess whether or not they are feasible, whether or not they threaten a conclusion, and so forth. So this is one of the things I considered in looking at this evidence.
And you found, and you said in your study, that to the extent that such a response bias exists, it would have led researchers to overestimate the prevalence of mental disorders in LGB groups, correct?
To the extent that it exists, it would.
All right. In his expert report, Professor Heyck wrote, in addition, lesbian, gay, bisexual people face other stressors. For example, because the AIDS epidemic has had a disproportionate impact on the gay male community in the United States, many gay and bisexual men have experienced the loss of a life partner. And gay, lesbian, and bisexual people alike have experienced extensive losses in their personal social networks resulting from the death of close friends and acquaintances. Treatment related to multiple losses is linked to higher levels of depressive symptoms. Do you agree with that statement? It's paragraph 31, note 13 of the Heyck report, and that's at tab 2, if you'd like to look at that. And it is on...
I'm sorry, what page?
It's tab 2. It's paragraph 31.
Okay.
Appears to be on, starts at the bottom of page 10. It's in the footnote. If you'd like to look at that, I'll read it. Well, I won't ask you to read it out loud, but if you just look at what he writes in that footnote.
Which footnote?
13 starts at the bottom of page 10.
You want me to read what it says?
Just to yourself.
Oh, okay.
My question is, do you agree with that statement? I already read for the... correct.
Yes, he's actually referring to something that I wrote, apparently, yes.
Okay, thank you. Your Honor, I still have a fair amount of material. Do you want me to continue?
Keep plowing.
Yes, sir. Yes, Your Honor. Please turn to tab 13 in the witness binder, Professor Meyer.
Yes.
You will see a document pre-marked DIX 1249.
Yeah.
Can you identify that document?
That's another article that I wrote, which was published last year in 2009 in a journal that's called Journal of Counseling Psychology.
Okay, thank you. And, Your Honor, we had a slight technical difficulty with this document. The PDF version that we provided plaintiffs and perhaps the court inadvertently had an exhibit stamp on each page, and so that obscured some of the words. We have corrected the problem in this hard copy, and we can provide corrective PDFs to the plaintiffs and the court if that's necessary.
Copy in my binder is fine.
Well, the hard copy is correct. The PDF, I believe, had the exhibit stamp on every page.
All right, well, why don't you correct that?
We'll take care of that, but I assume there's no prejudice since the citation was evident and Professor Meyer wrote it. And I would like to move that into evidence, DIX 1249, the version without the exhibit stamps on every page.
Fine.
Thank you.
1249 is admitted.
Please look at page 23, Professor Meyer.
Yes.
You write, but here lies the first problem for researchers of LGB populations. The population's definition is elusive. So defining the LGB population as a potential methodological problem in comparing mental health outcomes of LGB individuals to mental health outcomes of non-LGB individuals, correct?
Where is it? I assume that it is correct.
Well, no, the last question I didn't read from your report. So if you disagree with it, let me know. You wrote that here lies the first problem for researchers of LGB populations.
Where is that?
I'm sorry, it's page 23, second column, bottom paragraph, about the middle. It's a carryover paragraph.
Okay.
You write, but here lies the first problem for researchers of LGB populations. The population's definition is elusive. And then I asked you this question: is defining the LGB population a potential methodological problem in comparing rates or comparing mental health outcomes of LGB individuals to mental health outcomes of non-LGB individuals?
Is it
A potential methodological problem.
I'm not sure what you mean. What kind of problem? As I said in this article defining the population, regardless of LGB or any population, is the first step in conducting a study. And any study faces the challenge of definition of the population, because if you want to sample, you cannot, you have to know who it is you're sampling from, and there is a variety of steps that one takes in doing this. There's nothing specific to LGB populations, and some of the quotes I use here are just methodological issues. So when you say it causes a problem, I don't exactly see that as a problem. I see it as just this is part of what we do when we design a study. We look through all of these issues.
My question was whether it raises a potential problem.
I can come up with scenarios, I guess, but I cannot answer that question in the generic form. I would have to see exactly what we're talking about. It doesn't create a problem in principle, the fact that we have questions of definition. As I said, all studies start with questions of definition, so that fact doesn't create a problem.
Now, in the article we were just looking at, you noted that the population-based studies, one of the methodological problems they suffered from was that they did not use a sophisticated definition of the LGB population, correct?
Well, that's not exactly how I said it. What I said is that they used perhaps a limitation that they used one type of a definition, but I mean, obviously, I didn't think that there was that great a problem, and obviously the reviews of this journal didn't think it was that great of a problem, and the people who quote it, it's not... I mean, you're trying to suggest that it's some big problem. It's not.
Well, I would like to explore that based on what you wrote in this article. As you said in the first line, the population's definition is elusive, correct?
The population definition is elusive in every study. This is one of the great sampling methodologies. Sudman devotes a lot of effort to try to address that, and I quoted it here. As I said, this is the first step of trying to establish a study. If I wanted to study men, I would have to define what age group. Is there any particular residence that I'm interested in, or a region of the country? This is just basic survey methodology. This is the first step you have to decide, and it is challenging, you know? If you are interested in issues related to birth problems, you're going to study women of a particular age who are, you know, so those are just normal things. You know, what is a Latino? Do you include Mexicans, or do you include Puerto Ricans? This is what I'm talking about, that this is the issue that sampling methodologies confront as they design a study. And this is the first step, is to define a population, which we call the general population. Then you define the sampling population, which is a more specific definition of where you want to sample from. And there's further problems and issues of definition.
Well, let's talk about the first question. You said the general sample, not specific sample for LGB individuals. Is there a correct definition of the general LGB population?
Is there one correct definition? As I explained in this article, the definition depends on your purpose of the research. So, just as there is no correct definition of Latino, there is no correct or one correct. It is correct if it is responsive to the research questions that you're trying to answer. So it is only correct in that sense. Did you do a good job in defining the population so that you're getting at the population you are intending to study? You know, we talk about the kind of theoretical population and the actual population. So it is correct only in the sense that you correctly sampled the population of intention. So if I wanted to study Latinos and I defined it as Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, there is nothing incorrect about it because I didn't include any other Latino group. It's if that's what I was interested in. So in the same sense here, there is a variety of ways that you can measure what we're calling here in a general way LGB. So, for example, you might want to measure the behavior as the only thing that you're interested in which case that would be a correct thing if it makes sense for your purpose.
Okay. So I want to ask you two yes or no questions, if it's possible. First, there is no one correct definition of the LGB population, correct?
For the purpose of particular research.
Okay. Second, definitions of sexual minorities vary, correct?
All definitions, by definition, vary. If you are talking about definitions, they vary.
Well, let's be more concrete. Let's look at page 24, the first full paragraph you write, and this is starting with the second sentence of the first full paragraph in the first column on page 24. You write, researchers have distinguished among sexual identity, sexual behavior, and attraction. Although these overlap, that is, a person who is attracted to same-sex individuals may also have sex with same-sex individuals, this overlap is not great. Only among 15% of women and 24% of men do the three categories overlap.
Yeah, in this particular study that I quoted, yes.
So we have three partially, but only partially, overlapping concepts that have been used by researchers to define the LGBT population: sexual identity, sexual behavior, and attraction, correct?
Again, they might have used just one of them, or they might have used more. So those are three ways of defining that people have used in the field. Yes.
And some researchers may use a combination of those, correct?
Exactly.
All right, let's break this down. First of all, sexual identity. Identity labels, and even whether a person uses an LGB identity label at all, vary across generations, racial ethnic groups, geographical regions, education levels, and other group characteristics. Is that correct?
Yes.
Not all LGB individuals define themselves as LGB until some developmental tasks along the coming out process have been achieved, correct?
Yes.
This means that at any point, some people who answer truthfully that they are not LGB will, at a later point, define themselves as LGB, correct?
Yes, exactly, because they haven't yet. I referred before to the coming out process. So at some point, you might talk to a person and they would either hide it or have not yet defined themselves like that, and then they would truthfully answer no to the question.
Thank you. And furthermore, because of cultural diversity, some people who engage in same-sex behavior, who may be considered by others as sexual minorities and who may be of interest to the researcher, would not identify themselves as LGB, nor consider themselves a sexual minority by any name, regardless of the researcher's definition. Is that correct?
Yes.
So it's possible that the same individual may honestly give different answers when asked about his or her sexual identity at different times in his life, correct?
Yes.
It's possible that an individual who engages in same-sex behavior may honestly not identify himself or herself as LGB, correct?
Yes.
And both of these, well, that assumes that both of those questions assume that an individual gives an honest answer when asked his or her sexual identity, but it's also possible that some individuals will not give an honest answer to that question, correct?
Obviously, that it's possible that people will not give an honest answer.
And in fact, for LGB individuals, there may be a particular reason why they might be reluctant to answer that question, correct?
Yes. As I described before, concealing would be that, what I would refer to that.
Thank you. So let's turn next to sexual behavior. Behavioral definitions also vary, correct?
The behavioral definitions of what?
Of sexual orientation.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you. I guess they could differ in this time frame that people would have looked at. Yes.
Yes. So they could look at different time periods, correct?
Right.
All right. And because more people have same-sex sex in adolescence, defining sexual adolescence as sexual behavior ever includes more people than defining it in the past year, correct?
Right, but that will be true for anything. If you look at ever, you get more.
For example, you could ask someone whether they were African American ever or African American in the last year.
Well, that would actually, that is a very interesting phenomenon, but that is also possible. African American is an identity, so the identity part of it could vary, and in fact, it does vary. People who move into the United States, for example, who are, by our definition, African Americans, may not describe themselves as African American or even black. And there are studies that show that people who come from, for example, from the Caribbean, who are dark-colored, their parents don't describe themselves as black, but their offspring, after being educated in the United States and socialized, do. So definitions always vary. Certainly with African Americans, the term itself is relatively recent. Black was used before that, and Negro was used even before that. Senator Reed got into trouble for using that term. So those identities change, and they are responsive to the social context in many different ways. But obviously, the population itself doesn't change, but how people refer to themselves might change.
Okay, but for LGB individuals, the variance in the time period you are looking at can lead to significantly different estimates, correct, of the population.
Again, as I said, this is true for anything. We always look at lifetime, for example, versus 1 year. So if you look at the 1 year rate of a disorder, it will be a lot less than a lifetime.
Thank you. Now, there are also different ways in which a definition of sexual orientation that focus on attraction might vary, correct?
Yes.
All right. Now, the size of the LGBT population might vary a great deal, depending on how sexual orientation is defined, correct?
Right.
Thank you. And please look at tab 12 in the witness binder. You will find an exhibit pre-marked DIX 1248.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. 1248, yes.
And can you identify this document? I apologize, it doesn't have a cover sheet. It's an article you wrote with Laura Dean and others entitled Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Health Findings and Concerns. That was first published in the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Medical Association. Is that the document?
Yes, that is actually a report that tries to summarize some of the findings, health findings.
And I believe this is also PX 1004, which I believe is in evidence.
I can check that.
Could I ask the court to confirm that this is Laura Dean Meyer findings in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender health findings and concerns?
Correct.
Okay, so that's in evidence. All right, please look at page 135 in the exhibit. It's a lengthy exhibit, and that's towards the, not quite the end, but it's towards the end.
Yes.
In the second full paragraph of the second column, you write, recent national studies estimating the percentage of the population that falls into each of the three broad dimensions of identity, behavior, and attraction show that 1 to 4% of the population identifies as lesbian or gay, 2 to 6% of the population reports some same-sex behavior in the past 5 years, and up to 21% of the population reports same-sex attraction at least once in adulthood. And I will skip the citations. And then you go on to say, therefore, depending upon how it is defined and measured, 1 to 21% of the population could be classified as lesbian or gay to some degree, with the remainder classified as bisexual or heterosexual to some degree, correct?
If that's what it says here. And obviously, again, depending on the definition that you use for the finding of population, you will get different rates. If it's more expansive, inclusive, then you will get a high rate than if it is less expansive and inclusive.
Now, 1 to 21% seems like a great deal of variance.
I don't think anyone would say that attraction is a true measure of LGB, what we are talking about. So I think one of the things is when you measure things, you realize that it is not exactly the way that you think it is. So attraction is a very fluid thing in the sense that, for example, a woman tends to have less inhibitions about saying, this other person is attractive. That doesn't make her a lesbian because she said that. So that's why I'm saying it's a very definitional thing. For me, in my studies, I use identity, which is the standard that we use in the U.S. Census, for example, not in LGB, which is not measured, but let's say on race. So you know, those things are the same issues in measuring any kind of group's identity. If you wanted to, for example, measure race by skin tone, you will find that you have a huge number of people who maybe have a darker skin tone but are not identified as black. So to me, the attraction, personally as a researcher, I don't use the attraction definition because I find it very broad. And I use the identity when I am interested in issues, such as the ones we discussed today. But I might use behavior if I'm interested, for example, in HIV-related risk. So every researcher uses definition based on the purpose of their study or survey or whatever it is.
Okay, thank you. And Your Honor, I had more methodological questions, but I'm gonna skip ahead. I think we have dwelled on that long enough.
I'm sorry. Where are you?
It's Dusseault's line.
Yeah.
Your Honor, we have raised one issue, just something to note, we've not had a chance to look at 1004, while Meyer article as defendants 1247. We don't have an objection to defendants 1248. We didn't want the record to reflect they were the same.
Thank you I appreciate that clarification. And Your Honor, I would like to, would move DIX 1248 into evidence then.
Very well, so admitted.
Thank you. Now, Professor Meyer, it's your opinion that limiting marriage to opposite-sex couples causes minority stress for LGB individuals, correct?
That limiting, can you repeat?
Yes. Now, it is your opinion that limiting marriage to opposite-sex couples causes minority stress for LGB individuals, correct?
Yes, as I described earlier.
And it's your opinion that minority stress causes a higher prevalence of mental disorders, higher prevalence of certain symptoms of distress that don't rise to the level of formal disorders, including mood, anxiety, substance use problems, lower levels of well-being, and higher incidence of suicide attempts. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, does limiting marriage to opposite-sex couples cause minority stress for all gays and lesbians, or only for lesbians or gay couples who wish to marry?
Yeah, I would say all, because of, as I explained earlier, it is the message you send. So you can think about the event of marriage in a sense and say, well, this would only affect those people who want to marry. But the message that I described earlier of rejection or disapproval clearly applies to all gay people. So they would all, I can't predict what every single person that sees this, but there would be something that affects the rest of the social environment, regardless if you are personally interested in getting married. It is the message, in this case, in the constitutional amendment, that demonstrate that is of interest, or the meaning, as I said before, the social meaning.
So it affects all of them and not just those, all LGB and not just those wishing to marry. Is that correct?
It has the potential to affect, I never said that minority stress doesn't affect a single person in the same way. It is a potential.
Thank you for that clarification. Are you aware that same-sex marriage has been legal since 2004 in Massachusetts?
Yes.
Well, do LGBT individuals suffer from a lower prevalence of mental health disorders in Massachusetts than in California?
Well, the first answer is that I don't really know, but that's not how... I wouldn't expect it exactly that way that you are suggesting, that would be the test of that, because Massachusetts is not, an isolate in the United States, and, it would be more complicated for me to assess. So that alone would not change everything, so it's just one aspect of it. And certainly I would think that people in Massachusetts who are gay would feel more supported and welcome, so to speak. So in that sense, it would reduce the stress that they have had somewhat.
But your answer is that you don't know, correct?
Well, I don't have any data on that.
You don't have data.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Do LGBT individuals suffer from a lower prevalence of mood, anxiety, and substance use problems that do not meet the criteria for formal psychiatric disorders in Massachusetts and in California?
Again, the study wasn't done in the way that you're describing it, although a study was done looking at states where there's greater rights for gay and lesbian people, and it did show those things that you are alluding to. So it wasn't exactly done in the way that you are saying. It wasn't Massachusetts versus California. But in general, in the United States that offer more protections, gay and lesbian populations there fare better than in states that do not offer such protections. So to the extent that you can use that as a suggestion that it does have this effect that you are alluding to, but I don't know of a study that compared California to Massachusetts on any of those outcomes.
Okay. And I was planning to ask you about the other outcomes, but the answer would be the same.
Right. I don't know of a study that tested it either way.
Okay, thank you. Are you aware that same-sex marriage has been legal since 2001 in the Netherlands?
I am going to believe you on that. I am aware that it's legal.
Well, will represent to you that it was.
Okay.
So do LGBT individuals suffer from a lower prevalence of mental disorders in the Netherlands than in California?
I actually don't know the answer to that, although there are studies. I don't know the answer to that.
Or would your answer be the same if I asked about the other outcomes that you identified?
Right. I don't know the comparison. Honestly, I don't know what I can tell you the rates of all the disorders specifically to California, so I couldn't compare them. Most of the studies that I relied on were national studies that were not separated by state.
Okay, thank you. Now, You are aware that California allows same-sex couples to register as domestic partners, correct?
Yes, I've learned that.
And you believe that, quote, domestic partnership has almost no meaning, and to some extent it's incomprehensible to people as a social institution. Is that correct?
Yes,
And I apologize, I said quote, that was from your deposition.
correct.
And for opposing counsel benefit, I'll identify that as a transcript on page 80, 9 to 11.
Yeah, I believe I talked about it today as well.
Yes, and you believe that domestic partnership reduces the value of same-sex intimate relationships, correct?
Reduces? Yes.
Okay, and if domestic partnership and marriage were both available to same-sex couples, you think they would probably not choose domestic partnership, correct?
I would think that.
How are we doing on time, Mr. Nielsen?
15 minutes?
All right.
I'll try. Might be slightly optimistic, but I'm try to cut a lot of chaff from the wheat.
The longer we talk, the less wheat that's...
Please turn to page, or rather tab 14 in your witness binder. And I'm going to represent to you that this is the California statute governing domestic partnerships.
Okay.
And I'm going to read you part of this. And we could read it all, but I'm not going to read it all. If you look at section A, it says, registered domestic partners shall have the same rights, protections, and benefits, and shall be subject to the same responsibilities, obligations, and duties under law, whether they derive from statutes, administrative regulations, court rules, government policies, common law, or any other provisions or source of law as are granted to and imposed upon spouses. Were you aware that California law treated domestic partners in this manner?
Yeah, I am not aware of all of the legal issues around it, but I was aware that it is at least approximate in the same rights and benefits. But, as I said, it wasn't in my testimony or in my reports talking about those benefits and rights. I was talking about the social meaning and the social message that marriage conveys. So I wasn't studying that particular aspect
So that does
of...
not in any way change the opinions that you have offered in this case.
No, it certainly is a good thing that they offer benefits, but I'm just saying that that's not what I was focusing on. My focus is on the social meaning, the social place of marriage.
Sorry. Are you complete?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Do you believe that domestic partnerships stigmatize gay and lesbian individuals?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Do you believe that domestic partnerships stigmatize gay and lesbian individuals?
Yes.
Okay. Please look at tab 15 in the witness binder, and you'll see a document pre-marked DIX 1067. And as you can see, it's a letter from California Assembly Member Jackie Goldberg. And as you can also see, it concerns legislation titled AB 205.
I'm going to take your word on that.
And if you look at the heading underneath, it says, AB 205 will provide registered domestic partners with a number of significant new rights, benefits, responsibilities, and obligations. And I'm going to represent to you that that AB 205 was enacted into law, and that the principal portion of that law, as amended, was a statute that we were just looking at.
Okay.
Okay, so please turn to the last page of the exhibit, and please look at the italics. The italicized statement about 2.5 inches up from the bottom of the page.
Uh-huh, yes.
And it says, this bill is sponsored by Equality California. Other advocacy organizations that collaborated on the drafting of this bill included Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund, National Center for Lesbian Rights, and ACLU.
Yes.
And you are familiar with Equality California?
Yes, I believe they are the organization that opposed Proposition 8.
That's right. And in fact, you contributed money to the Equality California's No on 8 campaign, correct?
I should become familiar with them.
Well, do you believe that Equality California would sponsor legislation that stigmatizes LGB individuals?
Do I believe that they intend to stigmatize? No. But I think that doesn't change my answer to the question about domestic partnership. So whatever their intention was, I'm sure to better the lives of gay and lesbian individuals in California, but nonetheless, having a second type of institution that is clearly not the one that is desired by most people is stigmatizing.
All right. And if I were to ask you the same question about the involvement of Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund, National Center for Lesbian Rights, and the ACLU, your answer would be the same, correct?
Exactly.
All right, thank you. Your Honor, I would like to move DIX 1067 into evidence.
No objection.
Very well, 1067 is in.
And I would like to direct your attention to tab 18. You'll find the document pre-marked DIX 1020. Can you identify this document?
I got it. I don't believe I've seen it before. It says, Article Proposition 8 and the Future of American Same-Sex Marriage Activism, but I have not read it before, I believe.
And who is the author?
Jeffrey Redding?
And are you familiar with Jeffrey Redding?
No, I don't think so. I don't remember the name.
All right, I'm gonna, I won't question you about that document then. Have you done any research to determine whether, since it adopted AB 205, and that's the bill we were just talking about, LGB individuals in California suffer from worse mental health outcomes than LGB individuals in any jurisdiction that recognizes same-sex relationships as marriages?
No.
Okay, now at your deposition, and I would like you to turn to, well, you made a statement, and I just want to confirm that it was, in fact, a statement that you made, and it's, turn to tab 7, if you would. And that's a transcript of your deposition. And look at page 149. And the pages are a little confusing. There's 4 on each page.
That's okay.
And it's actually page 38 in the continuous pagination of at the bottom, if that's at all helpful.
I got it.
Your Honor, I'd object if it's not being offered to impeach anything.
Why are you offering it?
I was going to ask him whether he agreed with it. Perhaps I should ask him whether he agreed with it first, and then,
Why don't
he
you
does-
just ask him the statement?
yes, exactly.
Without referring to the deposition.
Yes, right. So when you speak of gay and lesbian people whose intimate relationship has not been granted societal approval, would that include gays and lesbians who are in a domestic partnership?
Yes, in the same sense that I discussed earlier about the social meaning of marriage versus domestic partnership.
Okay, now let's look at the deposition transcript. It's page 149, lines 16 through 20, and you can continue past that if you need to for context. So could you, you don't need to read it out loud, but could you read that and tell me whether you gave that testimony at your deposition?
Did I give this?
Did you say this at your deposition?
I don't have an independent recollection, but I read it here, and I presume it's correct.
Okay, and the statement, or the answer you gave to the question today was yes. And the answer at your deposition was, quote, no, I describe here, when I talk about these unions in the sense of the impact on stigma, I'm not really considering domestic partnership. And admittedly, they have many benefits, including maybe something that you were referring to just recently. But in terms of the impact that I'm referring to here, I wasn't talking about domestic partnerships. And as you said, you have no reason to think that you didn't give that testimony, correct?
Yeah, right, but I'm really not sure what the context of this is and what we were talking about before, so I don't know that it is replicating the question that I just agreed to. But my answer is that, what I just told you is what I still believe. I don't know that that necessarily in any way contradicts that.
Your Honor, if it's being offered for impeachment, could I add additional language in the interest of the rule of completeness?
Very well.
I'll just read it in so it's part of the record as well. This is from page 153, starting at line 3. Question. Perhaps domestic partnership is confusing and not well understood. Does it minimize the significance of the relationship? Answer. Yes. Because as I explained before, domestic partnership is compared with marriage. It refers to a similar thing. It refers to a couple being together, let's say, to a union. And therefore, when you use domestic partners, an obvious comparison would be with marriage. Now, in this case, or in any case really, domestic partnership is offered clearly as a secondary option, not as the most desirable option.
Very well. Shall we move on?
Yes, we shall. Now, Professor Meyer, you believe that laws are perhaps the strongest of social structures that uphold and enforce stigma, correct?
Yes, I believe I wrote that.
Yes. And as we've discussed, California recognizes same-sex relationships as domestic partnerships with essentially all the rights of marriage, correct?
Yes, I have to, again, I have no knowledge of the law specifically, but I understand that that's the case.
Are you aware that California law prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in housing?
Yeah, I'll take your word for that. I think I know that.
Are you aware that
but-
California law prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in businesses' provisions of services?
Again, I am not independently aware necessarily of all the legal issues of protection, but I am aware now that you tell me.
Okay. Are you aware that California law prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in employment?
The same answer.
Okay, and I could go on, and in the interest of time, I will not. But let me just ask you this. Leaving aside the question of marriage, are you aware of any other state whose law reflect less structural stigma than California?
Leaving aside the question of marriage, as I said, I'm not as familiar with the details of the protections either here or in other states, so it's going to be a very, I cannot answer that.
Okay, so the answer is, I don't know, correct?
I just cannot answer that. I don't know what the different legal, I would have to study this and look at this.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Now, you talked about Proposition 8 sending a message about the value of gay and lesbian relationships in your direct testimony. Did you intend by that to offer an opinion about the purposes of the people who drafted or voted for Proposition 8?
No.
All right, no further questions, Your Honor.
Very well. Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Dusseault?
Good afternoon, Mr. Meyer.
Good afternoon.
Almost evening, actually. I'll just say afternoon. Just a couple of things I want to follow up on. Mr. Nielsen spent a good deal of time this afternoon talking about your work in minority stress and social stress theory and the implications of that work with respect to groups. Not gay and lesbian groups, but let's say racial minority groups. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, is the point of this discussion that you have found in some of the research that certain racial and ethnic minorities, while they experience some stressors as a result of minority status, may not experience the same health effects as a result?
Correct. That's specifically with African Americans or blacks in the United States.
Okay. Now, doctor.
And I should just correct. This is not that I found this, but this is a finding that is definitely in the literature. It's not all my studies empirically, but there are studies. I found it in the sense that I read about it and so forth.
Okay. Now, Dr. Meyer, do you have any views as to any differences, let's say the African American minority community and the minority community of gay men and lesbians, that might explain some of the differences in terms of the outcomes of that flow from stressors?
Well, of course, as I mentioned, the reason we look at differences in the patterns of results is exactly to, as I said, to improve our models. And one of the things that we therefore analyze, and it's not just me, it would begin to look at, what is different between those two populations that might help us understand the workings of these social stressors. In terms of African American findings, there are several areas of further study that we're interested in. The first one that is most often advanced is and I'm discussing this in comparison to gay and lesbian here, is that while African Americans are definitely exposed to racism, in their socialization process, especially earlier on, they are typically exposed to greater benefits of the resources that I described before as coping and social support, for the very simple fact that they typically grow up in black communities. Of course, there might be some unique experiences, but there's evidence that being socialized by your family and educated about racism, being, taking part in, for example, institutions, black churches that have for really decades, if not centuries, been in place to combat the effects of racism, all the messages of racism. So, as a person growing up and being socialized, an African American person benefits from this social support affiliation. So as I described earlier, regarding gay and lesbian people, this is not how they grow up. Most gay and lesbian people, like most people in society, internalize very negative attitudes. And they do not have along the way access to gay supportive services and so forth until a later point where they have already come out and, really made the big step of affiliating themselves with some of the support. So this is one thing.
Okay, so before you move on, let me make sure that I understand this. So in the African American community, for example, typically an African American youth growing up would commonly be surrounded by African American siblings, parents, grandparents, perhaps community, church friends, etc. Is that right?
Correct.
But with gay men and lesbians growing up, they may not have the same community support and socialization support.
Yeah, I would say they definitely do not have this, that type of, the equivalent type of support addressing gay and lesbian, an affirmative gay and lesbian approach. As I said, it's almost, it's actually the opposite. And many times we found within even families, gay and lesbian individuals who are shunned or are harmed in many ways, including violence. So it's almost like the direct opposite of the support.
Are you talking about African American gays and lesbians or non-African American gays and lesbians?
Thank you, Your Honor. In this comparison, we're comparing the overall African American non-gay with overall white non-gay.
I see.
We were discussing in a previous response a different study that looked at gay African American versus gay white, in which I was talking about the added element of racism. But as Mr. Nielsen pointed out, this finding is it is also true in the general population, non-gay population, where African Americans also have lower rates. And therefore, that's why this analogy, it makes sense in the way that I was answering.
But when comparing the gay and lesbian population to the African American non-gay population, your testimony is that there is more socialization and support in the African American community that may explain a difference in certain outcomes.
Yes, that's one of the differences
More
that may explain.
socialization and support among
non-gay.
Wait a minute. More socialization and support for African American gays and lesbians?
Non-gay.
Non-gays.
So let me just clarify. We are talking about two different comparisons that are joined only by the general theoretical perspective of how a social stress could affect people. So the analogy here is that African Americans, being themselves, of course, subject to racism, should have a parallel finding that we find in the gay versus straight in African American non-gay with white non-gay. It's very different, but you expect some kind of parallel that the stress related to prejudice is affecting them, then it should also affect blacks. And the question here, questions here were, well, why isn't it true for non-gay African Americans versus non-gay white, where it's true for gay versus straight, regardless of color? So this is really going to be a whole different area that is not pertinent specifically to what I testified regarding gay and lesbian population. This is expanding toward an analysis of broader sociological theories and looking at some parallels in the findings across groups and across ideas.
Right. Okay, let me clarify. The line of questioning that I want to follow up on now was a line of questioning from Mr. Nielsen, suggesting that the theory of minority stress is taken from the gay and lesbian minority population to the African American minority population. Would you expect exactly the same health outcomes? And does that fact that you might not see the same health outcomes in some way suggest that this model doesn't work? Do you recall that discussion?
Right. And my answer is that it does not indicate that the model doesn't work. It indicates that there are differences in the characteristics of that this is not a perfect comparison. There are differences in the characteristics of race in terms of black versus white non-gays, and that from that comparison and the comparison of gay versus straight, a major difference is that blacks are socialized with a lot of with a variety of access to support for their race that comes to counter some of the effects of racism. Whereas gays are socialized with homophobia and without, in their families and original communities, say, access to a similar gay-related affirmation.
Okay. In some of the exhibits we've seen today, we've seen the term minority stress and the term social stress. Are those the same things?
As I responded to Mr. Nielsen, social stress can be maybe thought of as a broader category. And within that, in the African American comparison, people have talked about racism as stress. In the non-gay African American versus white, people have discussed it as a racism as stress. So I would put it within the general social stress approach, because here we're looking at racism. Whereas in my examples with gay and lesbian versus heterosexuals, we're looking at homophobia and some of the other things. So they're not obviously the same, but there's some theoretical parallel here that in this way that you study those different populations,
but when
the different comparisons.
Okay, but when you use the term minority stress in your research, are you referring generally to all minorities or specifically to gays and lesbians?
No. As I said, minority stress, which is a term that I helped popularize, refers to sexual minorities. And it is almost exclusively used in the literature with reference to sexual minorities. And I would dare to say many times referring to my own articles on that matter.
And the four processes that we spent a fair amount of time on this afternoon that embody minority stress, are those processes of general application or specific to the gay and lesbian population?
No, obviously, they are specific to the gay and lesbian population.
Okay. Let me ask you about one in particular, concealment. Would concealment be a similarly significant issue when you're talking about the gay and lesbian population as compared to a racial minority such as the African American population?
Not at all in the same way, for obvious reasons. Although the answer is no. There are some instances where somebody may be able to conceal his black identity, but it is mostly, we don't think of concealment when we think about the model of racism.
Okay, let me ask you, in this comparison of the gay and lesbian minority to the African American minority, about the issue of structural stigma. And you talked about the role of the law. Today in America, are African Americans subject to legal structural stigma in any way comparable to Proposition 8?
Well, obviously, as I said, this will be another difference between the two populations. When I was saying there are several differences, this is a major difference. I believe that at least since 1964, there are no legal types of racism in the United States. So in terms of the power of the law and of the state, there is no endorsement of racism. That does not mean that racism has abated, but certainly it is not parallel to what we were discussing today in terms of the structures of the law.
Is there any racial minority in the United States that's denied the right to marry?
I don't think so, but...
Well, with this issue of the extent to which a theory of minority stress or social stress applies to, let's say, a racial minority group, does any of the discussion or findings in that area in any way undermine your view that minority stress operates in the lives of gay and lesbian people and adversely affects health?
No, and there's no evidence for that. There's no real challenge in terms of the findings that are this confirming. Certainly, not all the findings are always perfectly as you would like them, but there's a majority of the studies done in the field, as I said, many of them that I quote, do not lead me to have doubt in the veracity of what I was testifying to. And the situation with the African Americans, as I said, is of great interest to me, as is the issue around gender, that is men versus women. It is something that I am very motivated to study. But it is really because of my intellectual curiosity and interest in, as I said, specifying the model. And the situation with the African Americans, as I said, is of great interest to me, as is the issue around gender, that is men versus women. It is something that I am very motivated to study, but it really is because of my intellectual curiosity and interest in, as I said, specifying the model better. Understanding how do these differences that we were just describing, for example, and there are others, how do they play into this causal change that I was describing earlier? So it is of interest, but it doesn't lead me to doubt anything regarding the specific case of minority stress in lesbian and gay men and bisexuals, which has been my work.
Okay. Now, Dr. Meyer, Mr. Nielsen asked you a series of questions where he presented you with a hypothesis, and then he would ask you whether a particular study or analysis was inconsistent with that hypothesis. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Is one of the purposes of a study to test whether a hypothesis is true or not?
That is the purpose of a study.
Mr. Nielsen also asked you about stigma in domestic partnerships, and he read you some examples of certain rights groups supporting domestic partnerships. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask just a couple of follow-up questions about that. Assume hypothetically that you have no right to marry for gay and lesbian people and no right to domestic partnership. Is it your view that gay and lesbian people are stigmatized?
They're stigmatized, as I showed, regardless of this. This is, as I said, an added block in the stigmatization, and I think a very important and forceful one in the sense that it has the power of the state and all that. But it is not the only stigma, if I understand your question.
Mm-hmm. Hypothetically, if you had a state in which there was no right to marry and no right to domestic partnership, is it your view that that would stigmatize gay and lesbian people?
Well, I think not having the right to marry would stigmatize them in the way that it stigmatizes them in this case.
Okay, and then alternatively, if in the same state, gay and lesbian people are denied the right to marry, but they are given a domestic partnership that is valued differently by society, would you view that to be a stigmatic effect as well?
Of course. In a sense, you're actually making a clearer statement of stigmatization when you have this dual system. Because it is not only that you're denying them the marriage, you're also saying this marriage is highly valued and that you cannot get that part, so we're giving you something that we're calling something else. So in some ways you could say, at least in the way that, is not in some general way, but you could say that the message is even more severe. But of course, it's kind of a silly comparison because I agree. I would say that if the state does not offer marriage, that alone is a stigma. But certainly, if you have two sides to this and you're saying you can only get to the back of the bus, that is quite more stigmatizing.
Okay, thank you. I have nothing further.
Very well, thank you, Dr. Meyer. You may step down.
Thank you.
And I think perhaps we'll pass on Ms. Z until tomorrow morning. Is that agreeable to everybody? All right, see you all at 8:30 tomorrow morning. A housekeeping matter, Mr. Boutros.